Hello, and thank you very much again for coming along. This evening we want to pay special tribute to a Cambridge citizen who in fact has been very important both nationally and internationally. And it's particularly appropriate to do so because it's the end of Black History Month. And this is a gentleman who's had enormous impact both here in Cambridge, nationally and internationally, in reference to the emergence of the field of both African and African American history. So for that reason we want to look, in a sense, as a tribute to all of his work underway, but also emphasize that it's inspired much more than just what he's done himself. And in that respect, he's a Cambridge global living legend. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. We want to both thank him and highlight some of his amazing accomplishments, plus, as you'd ask of any person who's done a great deal, what he's inspired in other people. He's well known, of course, to Cambridge community television viewers. He's occasionally interviewed online, and occasionally there are events that CCTV covers. And he is very graciously presented from time to time here in Boston. Back in 2009, there was a Cambridge Reads session devoted to his own work. You can recall it probably from having seen it.
This way. The French have a word that they use when they talk about wine. It's called terroir, and it means of a specific soil and a place that a wine is imparted with that, so that it becomes distinctive. And I thought of that as I read this book about you. And what part of Piedmont, West Virginia, would you say is terroir in your life?
My whole being is from Piedmont, West Virginia. You know, I'm just a little country boy.
Well, that's an interesting phrase. As he puts it, you know, I'm just a little old country boy. Well, that's one way he likes to characterize himself. But in fact, we know differently. He's an international figure, certainly an inspirer on the national level of a whole new approach to African and Afro-American history. And it's in that capacity that a lot of people have come to know him nationally through a lot of the PBS specials that he has hosted or narrated, including a whole series called Many Rivers to Cross. It was really quite an extraordinary analytical view at the history of the Afro-American culture and political impact in the country. He looked at sensitive issues, including what the leadership of the movement wasn't doing at the same time that other things were going on in the country. You can get a glimpse of it from looking at excerpts.
The end of April in 1960, over 50,000 students had staged sit-ins throughout the South. They were becoming the vanguard of the civil rights struggle. But they had little support or encouragement from the movement's leadership, accustomed to employing less aggressive tactics.
Activism was not the style of the civil rights movement. Some of our elders thought it was a bit much to be putting yourself up for jail and violence. They certainly refused to see young people as a part of their struggle.
A little-known 56-year-old civil rights veteran named Ella Baker would change that. Ella Baker, granddaughter of slaves, had been a grassroots organizer all over the South for 2 decades. A quiet but radical force.
She would say, like the turtle, you have to put your tail on the line. And students could understand that. And we did put our tails on the line.
Now, together with students less than half her age, Baker helped found a new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC.
Okay. The history of the nonviolent struggle is often subsumed under the history of Martin Luther King Jr. Quite rightfully, he has a central role in it, but it takes Skip Gates basically to go back and look at the narrative a little bit more subtly and say, listen, Ella Baker was there organizing among students half her age, as he says, and bringing to bear a kind of pressure on the black leadership at the time to move it much more directly and forcefully in its demands to national leaders. That's the kind of subtlety he brings to the study of history that's important at this point on every front. And you've seen other things. More recently, he's been looking at a series called Finding Your Roots, in which he invites personalities of one kind or another to subject themselves and their past to a little bit of scrutiny. And as a professional historian with a team of historians around him, he then goes in to look at the past of the genealogies of various individuals. He himself actually is not a historian, but a literary scholar and a literary critic of one kind or another that has been very influential in the stimulation of African American writing and in the publicity about previous writers. But in this role in Finding Your Roots, he's given a new dignity to the historical study in detail of very precise materials, often thought to be irrelevant or ignored until they were researched on the scale that he does it. You should watch the series whenever you can get a chance to it. It's called Finding Your Roots, again available on PBS throughout the country and now being circulated around the world. It's in this kind of historical study that he's given a whole new impulse to and dignity to the detailed study of documents, and particularly printed works, but also archival works. And he's encouraged a lot of people to look at printed works in a very different way. Initially, we thought of them in a sense as things that were on the shelf in old libraries, but he's started to open up that whole sphere to us, and in a sense given us the excuse plus the challenge to study everything within these volumes. Many of them, for example, of Africa during the slave trade have not only text over here, but have these fold-out views and maps. Maps that are absolutely crucial if you can take the time to study what they mean. It looks like just a travel account, but in fact, the detail on the coastline, in this case what's called the Gold Coast, which is what corresponds to the modern-day Ghana, is extraordinary, including the names of kingdoms to the interior and some history about the interaction with those kingdoms. It's on this level that he's invited us to look in detail at every aspect of the document here being the travelogue account, the historical account. Most documents have a verbal component to them, but he's urged us in effect to look beyond the verbal to the images involved, and the images are really quite striking if you look at them in detail. They have a lot of detail not recorded in the text. For example, here is something that historians have come back to again and again once he's pointed out that it's important. A lot of the documents have the internal architecture of some of these slaving castles along the coast and can be used as a means of starting to analyze what kinds of provisions were stored up, what kinds of space was given over to the storage of food. And the details in many of these castles are very, very precise. With A, B, C, they have references in the text to what was actually in each one of these rooms or storehouses right on the edge of the coast. Well, it's this kind of thing that has inspired historians, both where he works at Harvard, but elsewhere in the country, and in fact over in Europe as well, to start taking these volumes seriously. Volumes like those here in the library. I mean, start pulling them off the shelf and start investigating the ones that are down in Washington, for example, at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has reconstructed the original rooms, in fact, the original whole room, one room contains it, of the original collection that Jefferson, President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, gave to the Congress to constitute the first Library of Congress. It's a historic artifact in itself, but they very carefully reconstructed it so that you can see the books on the shelves here. Well, the thing to do is to reach over and pull some of these books out and start reading them for what they have information about, namely what was going on about them in that day. Well, as it turns out, in the middle of the 18th century, just prior to the American Revolution, there's a heck of a lot of information on the slave trade. And most of it, that's really quite valuable, is in graphic form, not in written accounts. The written accounts are crucial, you don't ignore those, but no one started to look until recently at the graphic material, and in part it's the inspiration of Professor Gates's work, because he's shown us how to do it. He's shown us how to look at a document very carefully and to inspect it for all it's worth, whether they're census lists or plantation diagrams or the like. He's done that kind of level of analysis, which now can allow us quite literally to open up the book, unfold the maps, not as something that was inconvenient that you just sort of brush over and look for the text, but something that you start analyzing in detail, and its particular components in detail. When you figure what was going on here is really quite staggering. These are gardens. What are gardens being grown out in front of the slave castle for? Well, it's a good bet that they're not growing tulips, right? This isn't for floral decorations. This has to do with the provisioning of the ships for the Middle Passage. What are they growing there? How much are they growing? How much do they have to grow to get this number of slaves, which are held in this castle, on the ship over to the New World and alive? And the key thing is alive. It does you no good to take a slave across to the New World that can't eat the crops that are being grown in the New World. So, guess what? All of these castles had in their shadow, quite literally, areas where they started experimenting with New World crops in Africa. New World crops that they knew the slaves would have to eat when they got to the New World. And in effect, they tested them out here in Africa and only took on the ships those who could eat the New World crops and survive on them. So while they're being stored in these castles, the slaves are being subjected to New World diet. The crops grown with maize and manioc and peanuts, for example, these are not African crops. They're brought into Africa from the New World. But since they grow in the New World, they're grown here in the castle for the castle's food supply while they're stored here as slaves, but also for the Middle Passage. And it's in that that we start to look at these diagrams in a very much more detailed and interesting way. Take a look at, for example, at the island of Gorée off of Senegal. We've got detailed accounts of what's involved here, and you can look at the maps and see the garden plots that are set up here, even on the small island of Gorée, not over in the mainland, but here they have them set up here, and there are several forts, and they tell you what's going on in each one of these numbered villages and the like. And it's worth documenting this stuff now, looking at the graphic document for as much information as the written document contains as well. Because there are several kinds of things that are visible if you start to look at the whole book together. You can see, for example, what the forts look like from the inside. And actually take a look at different vantage points from the inside of the different forts that are put in place. This was Fort Saint-Michel, and over here is Fort Saint-François, that the French and the Dutch had variously on this island. And you can, in fact, compare that with what's going on nowadays. You can actually go in on Google Earth and look at the island of Gorée as it exists now and see, in fact, what is on the ground compared to what used to be on the ground. That is, here's the map from the middle of the slave trade, and here's a view of what's going on now in Gorée today. You can take a kind of tour around it, and in some cases you can actually even zero in on the individual inside views of the fort. This is pretty extraordinary. This is a 360 view of what it looks like within the Fort Saint-François, which was one of the French forts at the time. And a recent tourist has recorded on a 360 camera what it looks like from the top, as it were. And you can take a virtual tour, looking down into where the slaves are kept and looking at the sort of military embattlements here that kept it protected. Well, this is the kind of detail that, in effect, Professor Gates's work has invited us to look at in detail and to think about. And, of course, some people have thought about it, and we actually have interesting narratives.
Island, which is just off the coast of Senegal. Now, for roughly 300 years, until the mid-1840s, millions of men, women, and children from Africa were kidnapped from their homes and communities and brought to this island to be sold as slaves. Now, on the island, we saw cells where dozens of people were packed together for months on end. We saw the courtyard where they were forced to stand naked while buyers examined them.
Now, this is the president of Senegal explaining to the president of the United States how this island of Gorée served as the kind of jump-off spot from Africa. They would, in effect, control the islands very much more easily than controlling mainland areas. So they would hold these forts, in many cases, on the islands off of the shore and use them as stocking points where they would amass the slaves and put them on the ships. So the president of Senegal is explaining to the president of the United States how this worked.
Negotiated a price and bought them as if they were nothing but property. And we saw what is known as the door of no return, the doorway through which these men and women and children passed on their way across the ocean to a life of slavery, a brutal journey many of us know as the Middle Passage. Now, standing there, I thought about the terror and grief these people must have felt as they took their last steps through that doorway, knowing they would never again see their families or their country. There is no way to undo what happened on Gorée Island and no way to erase the stain of slavery from our nation's past. But there is also no denying the course that history has taken since that time.
Well, this is the kind of thing that, in effect, Professor Gates has opened up to us, relating the past to the very dramatic present through documents like this that now make it possible for us all to go back and look at the books on the shelves in a very different way. This has been true not just in West Africa, but in South Africa as well. In fact, there's a very famous island there that has become the subject of many of us re-examining the different books on the shelf, you'll see Robben Island. And once again, Robben Island is something that Michelle can tell us about.
I just want to speak to you about our visit to Robben Island, an experience I'll never forget. Located off the coast of South Africa, from the 1960s through the 1990s, this island housed a maximum security prison. Many of the prisoners there were activists who worked to bring down apartheid, the South African government's policies that discriminated against people of color. Among those imprisoned at Robben Island were 3 men who went on to become president of South Africa, including Nelson Mandela and the current president, Jacob Zuma. So as we toured the island, I couldn't help but think about how this place must have shaped these leaders. We saw the rock quarry, where they spent their days doing back-breaking work in the blinding sun, and the tiny cells where they spent their nights. It was amazing to see Mandela's cell, a tiny room about 6 feet wide, where he spent 18 of the 27 years he was in prison. He slept on a thin mat on the floor, and when he stretched out to sleep at night, his toes touched one wall while his head grazed the other. Yet despite these conditions, Mandela and his fellow prisoners never lost hope. As Mandela once said, prison, far from breaking our spirits, made us more determined to continue with this battle until victory was won. So when these prisoners were finally released, their spirits were far from broken. Mandela went on to lead the movement to end apartheid and set up a new democratic government. He won a Nobel Peace Prize and became South Africa's first black president. While very few of us will ever encounter the kind of discrimination and brutality that Nelson Mandela endured, all of us can learn important lessons from his struggle. We can learn about the importance of standing up for what you believe in, no matter what the cost.
Okay, well, I can see the impact of this and the importance of starting to retrieve some of this information from the history books, made possible, again, for historians by the example that Skip has set. In Black History Month of 2016, we in Cambridge, therefore, would like to thank you very much, Professor Gates, for all you've accomplished and inspired. You've encouraged a lot of us to go back to the books in these libraries and take a new look at them. And you're not done with it. In the Black History Month, we've learned already that you're coming up with a new series. And this is why you're a Cambridge and global living legend. In April, I understand you're going to be doing this new series, And Still I Rise, on PBS. So we expect great things from you in this, and we look forward to it. You've taught us to undertake a transition, to begin a deeper and more inclusive self-education in our transition studies.